Thank you, Juliet, and the organizers. I'm really excited to be here. I was hustling some last-minute slides together this morning and realized that I kind of have the anti-infinity talk here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a particular artist, and one of the goals is to try to take seriously this interaction between mathematics and the arts, and see what could be possible. Try to raise some questions and maybe find some historical moments of contact, and see whether they resonate on the side of mathematics or the arts. But I'm going to start with a quote from Annie Albers, who said in a text called Work with Material, which I think has just been republished by Princeton on the occasion of an exhibition that just opened at the Bilbao and Guggenheim. The fact of the inherent laws of material is of importance. They introduce boundaries for a task of free imagination. These boundaries may be conceived as the skeleton of structure. So I'm going to tell you about Carl Andre, and I'll try to make some readings of his work from a mathematical perspective. So I put in my abstract structure, that word we just heard, which has a lot of resonance for mathematics, but it's not used always to mean the same thing, formalism as well as ornaments. Why Carl Andre? There was an exhibition that traveled around the world, just recently came down, but it was in Los Angeles, but it was here in Paris, I think through February. I don't know, did anybody see it? It's at the Musée de l'Odin. It actually started closer to my home in Beacon, New York. It was organized by a curator and a former curator of the Dia Foundation, Yasmin Raymond and Philippe Now. And I was, on the occasion of the show in Beacon, I was invited to give a gallery walkthrough. And I was a little bit surprised by that because I knew a little bit about Carl Andre. After preparing that talk, I felt I knew even less when I started. I'm not even sure how to pronounce his name. He has the same last name as our previous speaker, but I think he's from Massachusetts, Quincy, and he actually pronounces it Andre. But in the art world, I think it's Andre. Here he is in the Dwan Gallery, New York, 1966, installing still. He's a controversial figure, maybe more so in the United States than Europe, I'm not sure. Nevertheless, there's been sort of renewed scholarship in his work. And there are several points where he talks about mathematics with intention that I find provocative. So one statement he made was that my confidence in mathematics is a value that tends perpetually to approach zero, but never quite arrives. So he's an appreciator of mathematics as a kind of amateur. So we know some things about his library, but at this last point, neither am I a believer in the magic of numbers any more than I'm a believer in the magic of poetry. I'd like to show you some of the works that were in that exhibition. This piece, radial arm, saw, cut, sculpture, all the work I'm going to talk about dates from the late 50s to the mid 70s. Is a small piece here that he describes as part of this early phase when he was working with a saw, and there are already some features in this really kind of humble work that we'll come back to. Its profile in two different sides. It's kind of letter form that emerges, but I don't know if you can get the sense that the radial saw blade is cutting just directly in. It's not a chiseled piece. So he has this conception of his work as resulting from cutting. Up to a certain time I was cutting into things, then I realized that the thing I was cutting was the cut. Rather than cut into the material, I now use the material as the cut in space. So there's a kind of duality that is interesting, and as a mathematician we could sort of impose some idea on what he's talking about, but here's another piece from the same period, maple and plastic exercise. So it's a kind of plastic that when you cut it, it becomes opaque, and then you can see these two axes skew tunnels going through the piece. And last ladder, this is as it says, sort of late pieces. Incidentally, that's a Stella painting in the background. Frank Stella was loaning him some space. He told him not to touch the paint. He was judgmental about Carl Andre's promise as a painter, but gave him room to make some of these early works, which were photographed by another friend and graduate of Phillips Andover Academy, Hollis Frampton, took this photograph. So one of the things that you might project onto Carl Andre is an interpretation of space, and in particular the real line, in terms of cuts. So here's a passage from Richard Dedekind. If all points of the straight line fall into two classes, such that every point of the first class lies to the left of every point of the second class, then there exists one and only one point, which produces the division of all points into two classes, this severing the straight line into two portions. The assumption of this property of the line is nothing else but an axiom by which only we attribute to the line its continuity, by which our thinking endows the line with continuity. So this is one of the modern conceptions of what a real number is. And it appears as a quote in a book, The Formation of Concepts in Modern Mathematics by Friedrich Weissmann, an Austrian. It was translated in 1951, and it was one of the books that Carl Andre was reading in his interest in science and mathematics. He even brings it up. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. So, in a conversation with Hollis Frampton, that was kind of an interesting scenario. It's called 12 Dialogues, but in fact, they took turns as one typewriter, sort of writing out questions for each other, and then tag team responding on paper. Hollis Frampton brings up Andre's notion of a cut, and Andre says, Dedekind you're talking about. And then he has this passage. By extension, one might say that any single perception is a cut across the spectrum of stimuli available to us, this continuum. The cut itself, then, is not perceived. It's an operation, not a quantity. So this echoes of the quotes that we heard earlier from Aristotle. First, for me, the world is full of lathes, and I need to find out what kind of cylinders or cones or shapes they invent. So it's not only that you might have picked up this notion of the Dedekind cut, the Schnitt, from Weissmann, but even Weissmann in this text, where he's really aiming at a philosophical approach, he he invites his reader to think about these other notions. So he says, the reader should note once more that the application of this definition, the axiom of the cut, is not restricted to numbers. You may also think of it in terms of brightness, musical pitch, etc. And then he has a kind of side about color, and he says the color continuum has a structure entirely different from that of the number continuum, because he points out that we cannot say when two colors are immediately next to each other the way we can order numbers as being greater than another number. So this, I learned about this from a text by Alistair Ryder, who's a Carl Andre scholar. And then going back to look at Weissman, there's actually, you can kind of, if you wanted to run wild with it, you can sort of look for all kinds of things that might crop up in different areas of modern minimal art. So, for example, let me just make an aside here that Andre was working at this time, early time, and actually throughout, in more than one mode. So he's known mostly for his sculpture, but he was always writing a kind of concrete poetry. You can see what that says. So I need to zoom in here a little bit. So there is a pair of lines descending vertically and kind of overlapping and sort of playing with the space and intervals between words. Also taking and collaging text, and in some ways reminiscent of what, or shared enterprise that other artists of the period, Adrian Piper, has a piece called Concrete Infinity 6-inch Square from 1968, which begins, this square should be read as a whole, or these two vertical rectangles should be read from left to right or right to left, or proceeds to break up the page as a kind of field. And since we're here in Paris, I couldn't help recognize some parallels with what was happening at the same time with a group of experimental writers known as the Oulipo. Raymond Queneau publishes in 1961 with some encouragement from François de Lyonnais, Sans milliards de poèmes, in which the text is actually cut open to allow each of the 10 sonnets to be read by choice of any one line. So you get 10 to the 14 different sonnets. If we look, I haven't been able to find, maybe some people don't. I know that there was a Vito Conchi and Meyer, I believe, published a magazine, 0 to 9, in which works by Harry Matthews and other Oulipian and also Queneau appeared, but I don't think Andre submitted. But he has a piece called 100 Sonnets, which consists of 99 14-line poems with the same word repeated over and over. It begins with I think it's a block of eyes, and ends with flower. Along the way, there's tin. I can't not read this as int. It starts out as tin. We'll see fields of tin coming back later. So he's operating in these two spheres, at least these two. So when he kind of emerges on the scene in 1966, this is a well-known exhibition, Primary Structures, with a piece Lever, which is comprised of 137 bricks set in row. And building on that, so I wanted to give an example of this duality between the cut and the thing that is cut into. One of his most famous pieces, Equivalents 1 through 8. This was his second solo exhibition in 1966. It was followed the next year by a piece called Cuts at Virginia Dwan's gallery. I don't know if it's the same Dwan gallery in LA.
Sure.
Was this in LA? Or
This was in New York.
in New York? Okay, I think the next year he had a show there. So what he's done here is fill the gallery with the same, well actually these are concrete capstone, and left open these regions, all of which have, so the title I should say equivalent is because they all have the same area, and the last piece, so these are all 30 brick voids, and in the previous they're 120 physical bricks. So there's this notion that comes out of the cut as of a duality, as well as this notion of an operation, which I think is kind of provocative. So sculptures are the result of physical operations in the material world. So that's kind of it sounds like an accent, right? It's like the language is a little bit awkward. Okay, of course sculptures will involve something going on in the physical world, but the way he's stating it sounds to me like something that happened in geometry, in the history of geometry, with the explosion of non-Euclidean geometries, how to make uniform these different geometries. So reading more in Weissman, I found some evidence that he might have been aware of something called the Erlangen program of Felix Klein. This is an essay on sculpture for one of his gallerists' early show, E.C. Goossens. I can read a little bit. It's a list of words that suggest arrangements of space or buildings: so arch, aisle, bridge, bench, ball, bin, and they're arranged in a way that's either similar to one of his cut pieces or of Brancusi, whose work he was looking at very closely and interested in, the endless column. At the same time, his friend Lee Lozano, who apparently he was trading Scientific American issues with, has a list of titles, paintings around the same period, all verbs. She's written in red and underlined there: ream, spin, veer, span, cross, ram, repeal, charge. So this idea of work is a result of a singular operation. And probably most famously from this time, Richard Serra's Verbalist, 1967, 1968, in which begins to roll, to crease, to fold, to store, and I think midway down you have to cut. This was a kind of watershed moment, I think, for Serra. One of the most famous pieces to come out of this. He names titles directly after one of these lines of his Verbalist. This is To Lift from 1967. It's a sheet of rubber. Both Carl Andre and Richard Serra were mining the streets of Manhattan for material. And he tells a story about happening on a truckload of rubber, and this piece, which supports itself, bears a trace of the action. Richard was, at least in a recent conversation on the occasion of a show of his early work, discusses meeting with Andre in the studio and staring at these plates, which we'll get to in a second, and saying to Carl, we gotta get these plates up off the ground. In 1969, he and his friends managed to hack the 1-ton prop, which are lead plates, also called the House of Cards. So he's one of the, in mathematics, my understanding of the Erlangen program is that we can unify our understanding of different geometries by going to the group concept. So a group is a formalization of symmetries. So you have a kind of a base space, which could be a continuum or could be any kind of set. And then we can meaningfully compare different geometries by comparing how the grades structure this group concept. So it strikes me as a little bit unusual that Andre would have made this leap from operation to symmetry. Our other artists who might speak about symmetry, my sense is that they will use a more academic or classical notion of symmetry, but here he says, I arrived certainly through the example and teachings of Frank Stella at something which I call axial symmetry. This is a kind of symmetry in which any one part can replace any other part. That is, you might say the symmetry of the molecules in a glass of water. You can take any atom of the water and replace it with any other one. This has nothing to do with left or right hand or up or down. It's central and axial without axis. So actually him mentioning the left or right hand, I think around this time, Martin Gardner, who had his column, Mathematical Games in Scientific American, which was very popular, he published a collection, and maybe somebody can remember, but I think it's called like the Left-Handed Universe or something like that, where he collects his articles in. So it could have been through there that he was mentioning this, but he takes the equivalence between bricks and further reduces the dimension of its work with metal plates. So here's a piece from 1967, 5 by 20 Altstadt rectangle in Dusseldorf. This was the Conrad Fischer Gallery that was in a kind of tunnel space, and unlike the fire bricks or the capstones in concrete, this work was, you were invited to walk on, and not only were you walking on it, like they might have been in the Juan exhibition, but there's a sense in which it's almost imperceptible to work if you're not looking for it. So Andre liked to say that he liked work that if you didn't want to look at it, you could decide not to. It wouldn't bother you. If you stood in the middle of this piece and looked straight out, it might disappear from your field of vision. Here's another piece from the same period, installed in a different space. These are steel works. Things started to get a little bit more interesting when he began mixing materials and creating what he called alloys. So copper zinc plate from 1969. So looking at these, I think it's hard not to, especially after the last talk, to think about how we see these works when they're photographed versus when we're walking on them or around them. A piece like this might bring to mind, so let's skip ahead a little bit. Something like the work that we were just looking at before, in that this grid at the bottom of the field that our previous speaker was describing in terms of perspective is something that since the Renaissance we've somewhat internalized. And I'm interested in the way that Panofsky writes about mathematics in these pieces. Let me just read a brief passage. So this is from the same text that we were thinking about earlier, perspective as symbolic form. What makes a picture like Ambrogio Lorenzetti's enunciation of 1344 is so important is, first of all, that the visible orthogonals of the ground plane here are here for the first time all oriented towards a single point, undoubtedly with full mathematical consciousness, for the discovery of the vanishing point as the image of the infinitely distant points of all orthogonals is in a sense the concrete symbol of the discovery of the infinite itself. So for Panofsky, I think he brings in mathematics to speak about art in a way that's from the point of view of both the viewer and the artist. So he describes perspective as transforming the psychophysiological space into mathematical space. So when we look at the Andre works, I think there's a degree to which, when you're looking at them, it's hard to forget, or at least I'm interested in whether one can forget the convergence of these lines and how that interacts with our experience of space. Here's a ribbon piece that happens to be stretched out on not his work, but a tiled floor. His work in the 70s starts to move beyond the gallery confines, and they're still finite works, but they're now occupying different spheres. So here's a piece in tin or aluminum, I believe, in the water. Zinc inside-outside piece also brings to mind the correspondence between places that look the same but occupy different parts of our visual sphere. So one way we might think about this is through another passage of kind of a popular mathematics treatment that I think Carl Andre was aware of, and this is a foreword that was written on concepts of space. The foreword was written by Albert Einstein, and he has to say that now as to the concept of space, it seems that this was preceded by the psychologically simpler concept of place. Place is, first of all, a small portion of the Earth's surface, identified by name. The thing whose place is being specified is a material object, or body. If the concept of space is formed and limited in this fashion, then to speak of empty space has no meaning. He goes on. It's also possible, however, to think in a different way. Into a certain box we can place a definite number of grains of rice or cherries, etc. One can call this property of the space, the space of the box. There may be other boxes which in this sense have an equally large space. This concept space thus achieves a meaning which is free from any connection with a particular material object. In this way, by a natural extension of quote-unquote box space, one can arrive at the concept of an independent absolute space, unlimited in extent, in which all material objects are contained. This is quoted in a catalog essay for a show in 1991 that was at the Carmelite Monastery in Frankfurt. And I don't know for sure if this was something that Carl Andre had found, but I think the distinction between that Einstein's making here, which he describes as geometric versus kinematic, to me it sounds, this is my own bias showing through, it seems more like topology versus geometry. Topology being a study of this notion of place and locale, and geometry, this infinitely extensible measured space. But let's set that aside for now. It seems like that could be a candidate for what Andre means when he describes the progress of his own work as beginning with sculpture as form. So these wooden objects that you cut, and they're somehow unique to sculpture as structure. So the relations between elements. His notion of structure is more of a, I guess, architectonic. So he calls the pieces that are set on the floor, which by the way are not joined, they're plates that at the end of the show are stacked up and either shipped off or put in a closet, or in some cases, like the brick pieces, he made arrangements with the suppliers that he could return the bricks if they didn't sell. So those, for him, those were objects without structure because they were not built the way a Mark de Subero sculpture might be. And the final, is it the final? I got some dots there. Sculpture as place. So this notion of occupying a locale. It's interesting. You could have said site, another word that people were using. You could have said location or environment, but he chose the word place. And I'm wondering, speculating here. So let's see. What I would like to turn to now is thinking about. So here's the diagram. You heard a little bit about this already, so just in the interest of time, I'll get to another passage by Panofsky. So what happens with the change from psychophysiological to mathematical space? He notes, and this is partly where the title of his book comes from, through this peculiar carrying over of artistic objectivity into the domain of the phenomenal, perspective seals off religious art from the realm of the magical. But then it opens it to something entirely new, the realm of the visionary, where the miraculous becomes a direct experience of the beholder, and so permits him really to internalize the supernaturalness. I think this is an interesting way to think about perspective as a mathematical thing. In what sense does the skilled craftsperson or the geometer who performs perspectival calculations, to what sense have they internalized this vision? So I'll end with thinking a little bit more broadly about how we might conceive of the overlap between mathematics and the arts. Very recently, I've been looking at a particular mathematician who found himself in the kind of the middle of things in the modern art world of the 40s and 50s. And this is Max Dane. He was a student of David Hilbert. He emigrated from Germany by kind of circuitous route across America, working in various odd positions before landing at Black Mountain College, which, as many of you probably know, was an experimental liberal arts college in North Carolina, spanned from the 30s to the 50s before closing, and hosted a number of artists and poets and musicians and performing artists, especially during its summer sessions when people would decamp from New York, like John Cage or Merce Cunningham, but there were also many other people that Max Dane interacted with, not the least of included his students, such as Ruth Asawa, Dorothea Rockburn, Ray Johnson, and there were others. It's hard to track exactly who was in what classes, because it was a very free kind of environment and a lot of student involvement in the governance. Dane, this is probably the talk that he gave as his job talk. Why did Dane, a student of Hilbert, who solved the first to solve one of Hilbert's problems, have trouble getting a job? Well, he was, I think, 60 years old by the time he arrived, and although that didn't exclude the possibility of a position, it happened that he also really enjoyed the environs in the mountains of North Carolina. He writes in an article on ornament, the man who creates and observes ornaments has feelings that coincide to a substantial degree with the feelings of the man who creates and observes mathematics. For this reason, ornaments have a mathematical appearance and lend themselves to mathematical analysis. He sketches a kind of theory in this paper of ornament as applied mathematics. About half the paper is describing just what applied mathematics is and what the pitfalls of using applied mathematics are, whether it be finance or for making social changes, before he turns to ornament. But the emotion, and this is a hint of some of his reservations, the emotional origin must always be considered in this analysis, lest we interpret more mathematics into them than feelings of the creator. So one could try to make an argument about an artist, for example, Andre, that when he describes what he's trying to do with his work, that one could use this language, the language of an internalized conception of order or rhythm that he's responding to emotively. This has some resonance with some recent ideas. One idea about how mathematics stabilizes from one period to the next. If one does not assume that mathematics is a thing that exists in the world independent of our own existence, our own experience of mathematics. So in an article called Styles in Mathematical Practice that was published this year, David Rabouin cites Edwin Hutchins, an anthropologist, for how we might understand the way that material is useful for doing mathematics, so an engagement with material things. The cultural process of crystallizing conceptual models in material structure and saving those up through time puts modern humans in a world where thinking depends in significant measure on the availability of a set of physical structures that can be manipulated in this way. The final turn on this path is that when a material structure becomes very familiar, it may be possible to imagine a material structure when it's not present in the environment. Jane describes these sort of ornaments as theorems, and a piece like the void enclosed by the squares of 3, 4, and 5, well, most of us recognize as a model for a theorem, Pythagorean theorem. Is this what's going on with Andre? It's possible. We do know that he cited kind of ornament, Paleolithic ornament as an inspiration. He was skeptical of what he identified as skeuomorphs. I had to look that up. A skeuomorph is when you have a new technology and you use that technology to imitate an old technology. So in computer science, we talk about skeuomorphs are little folders that you have icons on your desktop. They're not folders, but they remind you how to use them. So maybe we could understand And this was the final step in his description of his work, his sculpture as an honor. Thank you.